Have you ever reconsidered your own life choices after playing, watching, or reading a certain piece of media? Have you ever felt ashamed for something you didn't even think much about at the time? Well, this is what happened to me. It was a hot summer afternoon. I had just graduated high school and my best friend was moving out of town, and I was still feeling a bit sad to see him go. However, imagine my surprise when he said he wanted me to hang onto his box of games for him. Along with his old PlayStation 2 console, I only got to play the PS2 a handful of times with him, and growing up as a kid, I owned a GameCube, much like the casual Nintendo fanboy I am. After a heartwarming last farewell, I eventually got back home and went downstairs to the living room of my house, where my big TV sat, and where I tended to play most of my video games. I decided to check out some of the games inside. While I stuck mainly with Nintendo systems growing up, I had recently gotten into more third-party games and other console exclusives, just wanting to personally expand my horizons a bit. He owned quite a few games, some of them being exclusive to the system, like Jak and Daxter, and Ape Escape 2, while others were multi-platform games I recognized and had seen or played before on the GameCube, like Sonic Heroes and SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom. Then, I noticed a very specific game. I recognized its box art like it was yesterday. I took the case out and took a good look at the bold yellow title imprinted on the top. Pac-Man World 2. I already mentioned I grew up with Nintendo systems, but when I was really young, my favorite franchise wasn't actually Super Mario, but Pac-Man. This was the specific game that jump-started my interest in the entire franchise, and was one of the first actual single-player experiences I had properly had at the time, with my older brother hogging all the games we used to own. Usually, when people think of Pac-Man, they would think of the arcade maze games, or its various other clones and sequels. But for me, what I used to care about were the adventure games. Pac-Man World was a trilogy of platformers released back in around the early 2000s, basically combining traditional Pac-Man elements with 3D platforming and exploration. I didn't actually play the original PlayStation 1 entry until years later, and my Pac-Man obsessed phase was short-lived. To say the least, after Pac-Man World 3, the series just sort of disappeared. One can argue Pac-Man is arguably still around and still getting new games, but none of them felt significant or worth it to me besides a set of tie-in games for a failed reboot. Over time, I sort of just forgot about Pac-Man. I forgot what he used to mean to me and moved on to Super Mario, which was getting more consistent big releases with the RPGs and 3D titles over the years. While I hadn't touched a Pac-Man game since 2011, I was eager to boot up my old childhood favorite game. I used to play the hell out of this, and back when I still remembered it existed. I honestly loved it more than some of my favorite Mario games, Super Mario Sunshine and Super Mario Galaxy respectively. I hastily got up and began setting up the PS2. I dug into a box again to fish out an old memory card my friend left behind before holding the case in front of me one last time. Despite its age, it was in really good condition, almost like it was never used all that much. I opened up the case and examined the disc, which didn't have a scratch or blemish on it. While I played the GameCube version growing up, I knew that it essentially was the exact same game on each of the platforms it released, so I knew what I was getting into. Or, at least I thought I did at the time. After going through the standard PS2 booting screen, the copyright notice, along with the bouncy old Namco logo, displayed before taking me to the cinematic, with the familiar sight of Pinky spying through Pac-Man's window as he sleeps before being scared by his pet dog, Chomp Chomp. Everything was just as I remembered it. The Ghost Gang, the standard antagonists of the Pac-Man series, Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde, eventually all met up at the central tree of Pac Village, plucking the golden fruit, and fooling around before unintentionally awakening the game's main villain, Spooky, whom recruits them to do his bidding and get rid of all the Pac people.
You there, take these golden fruit that imprisoned me and follow me if you want to get rid of these Pac people forever!
Afterwards, the game took me to the bright and cheerful title screen of Pac-Man in the center of the screen, stationed on the platform of a pier and kicking around the game's main logo like a soccer ball before comically taking a bite out of it, which somehow plastered it on the top of the screen. I listened to the familiar overture of the game for a few seconds before finally deciding to start a new game. Pac-Man then turned around and walked into the woods behind him as the screen arises. Unfortunately, it seemed this memory card didn't have any prior save data for the game on it. But that frankly didn't bother me. I was planning to start from scratch anyway. But I did find it a bit peculiar. After creating a new file, the next FMV cutscene played. Pac-Man wakes up only to be greeted by Professor Pac, warning him about what the ghost just did and the danger he was about to fight against, that being Spooky. He explains that Pac-Man needs to collect all 5 of the golden fruit in order to imprison the death of the Ghost Lord under the tree once more, much like his ancestors did. Otherwise, it was the curtains for his hometown, Pac-Land. Once again, nothing out of the ordinary from what I remember with the GameCube version of the game.
Retrieve the golden fruit and defeat Spooky, or all of Pac-Land will be doomed.
After this, I was taken to the first level of the game, Pac Village. This was more of a central hub area, without any level selection or a playground to test your skills. I spent a few minutes getting used to the PS2's control scheme and controller before finally moving on. After all, I never exactly knew how to get those damn fruits on the rooftops of the houses. After this, it was on to the first real stage of the game, aptly named The Bare Basics. A very warm, inviting, melancholic version of the game's overture served as the stage's main background music, and my first obstacle in my path was a little maze area with some power pellets and ghosts, something the first Pac-Man world on PS1 called Ghost Zones. I gobbled the ghosts and collected everything in the area before moving onward. The next obstacle afterwards was some basic cliffs that taught the player the main function of jumping. However, before I made my way to the upper terrain, I noticed what looked like a red pair of shoes, just on the grass above me. I made Pac-Man leap and climb up, only to find that whatever was there had just mysteriously vanished or ran away. I ignored it and continued through the level, jumping over 2 basic bottomless pits and using Pac-Man's signature Rev Roll ability to climb up a steep hill. I performed a butt bounce on the button up top and chomped on the Pac Dot chain, leading to the final little stretch of the level. I navigated through those thorn bushes before finally making it to the pond. Just then, I saw something in the distance, near where the end of the level was. It looked like some sort of cartoony humanoid figure. I could barely make out most of the details, but it seemed like it had 2 big rabbit ears protruding from its head. I didn't even bother collecting anything else and swam my way across the pond to get a better glimpse of it, only for it to just vanish again. As I made my way to the goal of the level, I could just barely see it leaping into the woods behind it. Of course, for me, I wasn't allowed to go any further as it locked Pac-Man into his victory animation. I was getting really suspicious at this point. I never recalled anything like this in the GameCube version of the game. I know that Namco, the developers of the game, are wants to hide little cameos from their other games in most of their titles as sort of crossover references. Though, for instance, later on in this very game, you came across Pukas, little red iconic tomato-like enemies from the game Dig Dug. But this character just looked flat out unfamiliar to me, and I still didn't exactly have a good glimpse at their appearance. The only thing I know for a fact is that it was wearing those little red shoes I saw near the start of the level. After having my score tally up briefly, it was on to the next level of the game, Canyon Chaos. A fairly straightforward linear stage with some bottomless pits. I didn't see any sign of that weird creature anywhere, though, so I tried to shrug it off and just continue with the game. Somewhere in the halfway mark of the stage, there's the large platform with a giant bear you have to revel against to defeat, which rewards you with a Galaxian ship. Little trinkets that teleport Pac-Man to a short little maze minigames that play like the original arcade game. Naturally, because I was collecting everything throughout the level at that point, I decided to go and slay the bear and retrieve it just for completionist's sake. After a short little game of classic Pac-Man, I was transported back into the level with a newly created checkpoint from where I grabbed the Galaxian. As I looked around though, I noticed something nearby on the cliff above. It was that thing from before, only this time I actually had a better glimpse at it. It appeared to be wearing clothes. A blue cap, a light blue jacket, dark blue shorts, yellow gloves, and the aforementioned red shoes. The creature seemed to have two-toned fur, mostly jet black with a little white muzzle of fur patches on the ears. The face looked almost like that of a fox or a cat. Honestly, it just looked like something more fitting for the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise than anything like Pac-Man. Just as I suspected though, as I climbed up to the tree and approached it, it started running and jumping in the opposite direction, as if it was running away and avoiding me. Naturally, anyone who played this game knows that the level ends with a giant cliff wall where Pac-Man can only exit the level utilizing a tiny Pac Dot, or rather an unutilized power-up that allows him to fit into tight spaces. There's no way it should have been able to escape, but somehow it managed to jump on platforms and ledges Pac-Man otherwise didn't have access to by any normal means without glitching or hacking the game. Scenery that was otherwise considered out of bounds for the player. And it escaped my grasp yet again. This became a recurring trend throughout my playthrough. The creature would typically show up halfway through the level, watching from afar before running off. If Pac-Man tried to get any closer, he was always one step ahead of me, plus he was able to jump higher and run faster than Pac-Man, along with using the long ears to fly across large gaps or death pits. He could even utilize things like bedoing trampolines, something no other entity in the game other than Pac-Man himself could interact with. The only levels I remember this character not appearing in were the boss battles against the members of the Ghost Gang, which were entirely unchanged and no different from any other version of the game, as well as the entirety of the underwater world. I wasn't able to document all the findings, so here's the ones I specifically remembered. Pac-Dot Pond appeared near the end of the level, right after the player got past the central pond area and near the path to the exit of the goal. Bedoing Woods appeared on one of the tall cut trees stumps near this last stretch of the level with the floating boxes in rows of blue bedoings. Butane Pain appeared after the first set of flame jets. As the stage progressed, he'd activate ones he passed by, which had to either be disabled or have Pac-Man find a steel ball power-up to progress unscathed. Avalanche Alley appeared on the path to the final stretch of the level. The cave, once he entered the cave though, he was nowhere to be seen. He probably ran ahead of me, not that I could tell with the camera circling and centering in front of Pac-Land, Crash Bandicoot style to warn him of the avalanche that trails behind him. Blade Mountain. Probably the most unique appearance in this stage. Pac-Man has to slide down a frozen river with ice skates Going upward is pretty much forbidden, and the momentum and movement are heavily influenced by the slope trajectory. As I entered the first cave, everything seemed normal. I kind of had my doubts I'd see the character in a stage that's otherwise as fast-paced as this. However, I ate my own words after I came out of the cave only to see the creature spinning ahead of me on what appears to be some sort of hoverboard. Or snowboard? I couldn't entirely tell, but I tried my best to tread behind him. At the end, he jumps and speeds off into an inaccessible cave behind the exit portal, so I couldn't follow him any further than that. Into the volcano. As I mentioned earlier, this is where the Pukas from Dig Dug make their brief appearance as enemies. The creatures seem to use those things to their advantage, mostly to cross gaps by grabbing them and then throwing them underneath them to thrust them upward. After finally taking care of Blinky, you know, the red ghost, whom was by far the hardest boss in the entire game, and slugging through the entire water levels, I finally found myself at the last stretch of the game, Ghost Island. Before I go on, I want to mention that up until this playthrough, I never made it this far in the game when I was younger, so at the time I still couldn't tell if what I was experiencing was what would be considered normal or not. When I was younger, I never got past the volcano world, and by extension, never saw the actual end of the game. Despite all the weird appearances of this strange rabbit creature who seemingly stalked me throughout the whole adventure, I was still eager to finally beat my childhood game, and I wasn't going to let anything stand in my way. I had Pac-Man climb onto the shore of the island and selected the first level of the final world, Haunted Boardwalk. What's unique about this level is that Pac-Man does a pair of rollerblades to traverse the stage. They function somewhat similar to the ice skates in Blade Mountain, only they were much easier to steer, weren't affected much by slope angles, and Pac-Man was able to utilize his butt bounce again. I made my way through the level, collecting some Pac Dots and a few fruits. As I continued through the pier, I noticed there were no enemies present. Now, normally, this stage is supposed to be swarming with ghosts that toss fireballs at you, and bats that zoom by and sweep downward in an attempt to bite you. However, being unfamiliar with the game, I just assumed what I was playing through was normal. It wasn't a particularly hard level, aside from the crumbling dock pieces, something being unpredictable, which made 100%ing the level a big pain. But after Ice River Run, I kinda stopped caring about trying to get everything throughout all the stages. I managed to beat the level relatively quickly, save for a few lost lives thanks to those falling pillars not letting me climb up properly. The next level, Nightcrawling, on the other hand, had the most interesting changes. When I booted it up, I noticed these strange new enemies that didn't even look like they were from a Pac-Man game. Normally, this level is filled to the brim with a bunch of sword-wielding skeletons from the first Pac-Man world, along with the ghosts and bats I aforementioned from Haunted Boardwalk. Here instead, I found strange purple things with big eyes, angry green eyes, and a weird pair of sharp ears that resembled bull horns. What looked like little Saiyan ghost creatures with small yellow eyes and halo rings, and in the place of the ghosts, there were these blue flames that would slowly creep toward Pac-Man. I tried eating a power pellet to see if it would do anything, and I just ended up taking damage, with Pac-Man lighting on fire for a brief moment, similar to the jumping fireballs in the volcano levels. So, with no way to kill these spirits, all I could do was avoid them. The purple bowl things were defeated by reveling into them, then butt bouncing on top, similar to the revel ram enemies seen in the snow levels. However, unlike the rams, their main attack consisted of throwing projectiles, so I tried to dispatch them every chance I could get. The Saiyan ghost things behaved similarly to the bats, except they seemed to produce a light source wherever they moved. What unnerved me the most was the middle point of the level, though. Now, in the original game, there's this top-down view maze you have to navigate while avoiding giant spiders that come around the corner to try and ambush you. However, when you go to the maze, there was no spiders. Instead, I found stacks of these weird colored blob creatures, varying in colors of red, green, and blue. They weren't moving, and they had a blank expression on their face when their eyes closed, frowning. Were these things dead? I tried to interact with them, and performed a butt bounce on one of them. Aside from having an animation comically squashed and stretching the model from the impact, the creatures didn't react. Now, Pac-Man is a very kid-oriented franchise, so to see something that outright resembled a carcass just felt out of place. Why would Namco put something like this in such an otherwise lighthearted, silly game? This wasn't a living, spooky skeleton or anything like the enemies typically found throughout the normal game, nor was it a mythical creature of folklore. I just didn't understand. Who killed these things, and why? Sure, there was no blood or anything graphic, but it felt more than a little bit creepy, staring at their eternally frowning faces, not breathing or anything. Finally, I reached the final stage of the entire game, not counting the final confrontation with Spooky. Ghost Bayou. I hadn't seen the rabbit creature for the entirety of this set of levels so far, but after what I experienced in Nightcrawling, I was all then a bit curious to find out what the game was going to throw at me next. Why was this game getting seemingly darker and more depressing? As the level loaded in, I noticed a thick, dense fog clouded my vision, and I could barely see any more than about 2 feet in front of Pac-Man's face. Spawning on a dock platform, I made my way to the only direction there was, forward onto a patch of dirt surrounded by water. Then the game transitioned to a cinematic, focusing on a big creepy tree with a pulsating face, carved in it with fire burning inside, making the horrific cutout light up like a jack-o'-lantern. This actually was the same thing that happened in the normal game. As I'd later find out, the tree, that being Wormwood, introduced himself, and he taunts Pac-Man, saying that in order to make it spooky, he would have to deal with his maze, further adding that the yellow guy would make an excellent addition to his graveyard. Again, all stuff that happened in the original game, but even then, that last line made it feel uncomfortable, as if I knew something bad was going to unravel from this. Much like the vanilla game, I walked along the tall ascending pier before activating a pack-dot chain that took me to a set of crumbling boardwalks. Now, where things differ again is that after making it past the crumbling docks, Wormwood would normally taunt Pac-Man about how he couldn't get past the fence behind him to progress onward, which is where the player would have to hunt down a button to activate another pack-dot chain to get past it and continue the stage. Here, though, Wormwood didn't say any witty dialogue, nor did the pack-dot chain go over the fence, but seemingly a different direction far to the left, into the darkness. I had my doubts, but again, I didn't know any better. Never actually getting this far when I was younger, I took my chances and chopped on the chain of pellets. Pac-Man was taken to a singular linear island pathway of dirt similar to the ones found throughout the level normally. Only here, it seemed to go in a straight line, with nowhere else to seemingly go. I started making Pac-Man walk, trying to make sure I didn't accidentally slip into the instant death water. It didn't feel like I was going anywhere, but after a few seconds of walking, I heard the music slowly start to die out until there was nothing but silence, and the sounds of Pac-Man's own footsteps. Not even the usual ambient noises were playing anymore. I checked my TV volume just to see if it was working perfectly fine. And then I paused the game to check the sound options, only to see that they haven't been touched ever since I started playing. After I unpaused, Pac-Man just started moving on his own without any input. None of the button inputs were responding anymore at this point, so all I could do was watch. Pac-Man reached the end of the path, cutting off in front of a small tombstone, similar to the ones seen around Wormwood, only this one was submerged in water. Black bars appeared on the top and bottom of the screen again, indicating that what was happening was a cutscene, much like the beginning of the level with my encounter with Wormwood. I slowly started hearing what I guess was music. It wasn't like anything I heard from the game before. It started out slow and very soft. I heard what almost sounded like wind chimes echoing in the distance, overshadowed by a loud, deep drone. The camera shifted to face Pac-Man from the front, not even doing this exaggerated breathing animation like he does normally in these cinematics. He was instead frowning, just looking straight at me and blinking. Then a single line of dialogue popped up.
Are you happy?
What? Was Pac-Man talking to me? No, he couldn't have been. He's a silent protagonist throughout the entire game. The game gave me a yes and no prompt. The music started to build up, sounding like a distorted, depressing melody with a strong wind blowing over it. I was more than a bit unnerved by this and hastily selected the most honest answer, no.
Are you proud of yourself?
Once again, the game gave me a yes and no prompt. I once again was honest with myself, only this time I said yes, considering all the strange things I had experienced up to this point, such as the weird rabbit creature who kept stalking me, to the changed enemies and night crawling. I quite frankly was happy that I managed to put up with the game so far despite these abnormalities.
Look around you. They're all dead because of you.
I didn't understand this. In universe, Pac-Man is your typical good guy, not a villain. He lived with his loving wife and a kid, and righteously set out on adventures out of his own desire to do good. He never outright killed anyone. At least anyone that was being a civilized being. That's for sure. None of this was making sense to me. Was there something I just didn't know about? I used to play all the Pac-Man games back in the 2000s. And I don't recall any events or stories saying that at one point the yellow dude himself committed what I would assume was mass murder or genocide. Aside from this, just seeing the mere mention of such heavy subjects, such as outright grieving and loss, really didn't seem like something Namco themselves would have let slide for their kid-oriented mascot series. This seemed a bit too real of a subject to be discussing in a kid's game like this.
And her.
The camera snapped to the face of the gravestone that was in front of Pac-Man. I saw what looked like two little square symbols. I decided to pull out my phone and open my translator app, and sure enough, much like I suspected, it appeared to be Japanese. Then text translated to Roro, or something like that. I guess it wasn't 100% accurate, and I really couldn't tell at the time. I swore I heard what sounded like a brief, peaceful melody amongst the distorted background soundtrack play for a brief moment before, once again, the music started to fade out along with the ambient noises.
I'll never see her again.
The camera snapped back to Pac-Man. His animation changed one last time to what I can only assume was a fearful gulp, as he knew whatever presence was talking to him was very uncomfortably close. Sure enough, the camera rotated to reveal the familiar-looking rabbit creature standing right behind him, only this time he looked angry. His hands were trembling, all balled up into fists. However, I also noticed at the same time what looked like small tears dropping from his eyes and down his cheeks. Whoever and whatever this creature was, he was significantly hurt by whatever Pac-Man had allegedly done. Then, two more short dialogue boxes popped up. I was prepared for the worst.
You took everything away from me! At last, you will feel my pain.
And, with a furious shove, the creature pushed Pac-Man into the water, killing him instantly. There was no blood or morbidly different death animation, just his usual twirling with the comical crosses placed on his eyes, whenever he'd normally lost life. After the screen faded out, I was expecting to be taken to my last checkpoint, but instead, it just stayed there on a black screen. I waited for a couple of minutes before deciding I had no other option but to reset my PS2. I was perplexed. Who the hell was this rabbit creature? And why did he seemingly hold such a bitter grudge against Pac-Man to go out of his way to stalk him on his entire adventure? What did all this even mean? Pac-Man is already a very kid-oriented series, much like I mentioned before. Arguably more so than even something like Mario. So why was this even in the game to begin with? This couldn't have been an Easter egg, yet I also doubt this was hacked, considering the events that transpired afterward, as well as the fact I barely knew many bootleg games for the system. I decided as I went into the game again, I'd try to record footage and ask questions later. Unfortunately, as I went through the Ghost Bayou again, everything seemed to revert back to the way it was in the normal game. And I was able to properly finish the level this time. Everything was seemingly back to the way it was. Right down to the final showdown was spooky.
Curse you, Pac-Man! My ghost will free me again!
I knew we couldn't take Pac-Man. Did he say that we free him again?
but even the satisfaction of beating my favorite childhood game wasn't enough for me. And all I could do, when watching the ending credits that night, was just think about what in the world Pac-Man even did to that creature to begin with. After beating Spooky that night, I finally shut off the PS2 and went to bed. I still didn't believe what I had just seen. As crazy as it may have seemed to many, it almost felt like the game was trying to communicate some type of message to me. But why? Many questions filled my mind that night. The first being, why did I never know about this being in the game until now? Who was that long-eared creature? And just why did he seemingly have such a bitter hatred against Pac-Man of all things? I am no stranger to dark or unsettling content in children's games, as it's something Super Mario has tackled several times, with certain story elements or enemy designs. But something just felt off. At least when it came to this, Pac-Man is a franchise that I consider even more aimed towards children than something like Mario, as I said before, and despite something like Pac-Man World 3 existing, I knew this was still a very lighthearted series that never exactly went into subjects like straight-up loss or grieving. The next morning, I immediately went online in an attempt to find answers for what I saw that night. I tried searching to see if anyone else had familiar occurrences or found the same secrets that I had apparently uncovered, but to no avail. I even made a thread on a gaming forum I would frequently visit only to be told that it never existed or that they had yet to even find any traces of what I had seen. Around mid-afternoon, I headed to my downstairs gaming room only to find the exact same box of games my friend had given me right off to the side of my eye. It was wide open and there seemed to be a game on top of the pile, which the light from the sun coming from my window reflected off of. I went hunched over and grabbed the case, noticing something rather eerily familiar on the cover. It was that thing. The same rabbit creature I had encountered last night in the game. I didn't know what to feel. I was kinda spooked that just now I was finding out that the entity that haunted me throughout an entirely different game had a video game of his own. At the top of the box was the logo printed in big blue bold letters with a white subtitle underneath. Klonoa 2, Lunatea's Veil. Something inside just told me to look into this game, thinking it at least provided me with some answers to what I saw last night. But at the same time, I was kind of afraid. I really didn't know what to expect after I saw this same character follow and haunt me throughout Pac-Man World 2. But I mustered up the courage to swap the disc in my PS2 with this new game I never played before. It wasn't what I was expecting, so I was kind of surprised. After this, I was taken to a basic menu screen along with a file selection prompt where I decided, much like Pac-Man World 2, to play the game all the way from scratch. I spent about a month and a half finishing this game, and it was heavily story-focused, so I won't go into too much details, but the story revolved around this place called Lunatea, and the rabbit creature was Klonoa, who takes the role of what everyone in the game refers to as the Dream Traveler. The game was basically a 2.5D platformer. You moved along a linear 2D axis but could interact with stuff in the background and foreground. Throughout the game, he is followed by these two companions who rescued him from the ocean, one of which is Popka, a weird dog-like creature, and Lolo, an innocent little girl who looked arguably more human than anyone else. Though I swear she had attributes that also reminded me of either a monkey or a lion. Throughout the game, Lolo powers Klonoa's signature weapon, the ring powered by a green gem, allowing him to pick up, carry, and throw enemies and various objects by inflating them like balloons. He could even perform double jumps by throwing them beneath himself, similar to what I saw him do with the Pukas back in Pac-Man World 2. I noticed a lot of parallels between this game and what I saw back in the other one. Klonoa could flap his long ears to briefly hover and cross gaps. I saw the same enemies, I saw night crawling, the further I progressed, and even the weird blob-like creatures as a common Goomba-esque enemy used throughout the entire game. Heck, there were even various sections of the game where he'd use the airboard to serve across long stretches of land such as rivers and even waterfalls. The game tackled surprisingly serious themes such as depression and sorrow for its central storyline. For instance, there was a part where we got a glimpse into Lolo's past prior to Klonoa's arrival at Lunatea. However, what got me the most was the ending. I'm not gonna spoil it for those who haven't played it, but let me just say it hits quite hard. I actually really ended up enjoying this game, but it still didn't entirely answer my question. Why did Klonoa seem to hate Pac-Man so much? Heck, on the cover of the box, as well as in-game, he had a visible emblem of the iconic 2D Pac-Man pizza shape eating a Pac-Dot. Things just weren't adding up. I spent the rest of the summer deciding to research the series a bit more on the internet. Similar to Pac-Man World, it started out on the original PlayStation with its first game. However, it seemingly is very expensive to get physically now, so I resorted to looking up a long play of the game just to get a grasp on what it was like. I won't spoil it, but I will say, combined with the ending of its sequel, it made me view Klonoa as a really tragic character. The series had various handheld spin-offs, including the RPG action game that was only in Japan. Unfortunately, the series seemed to have come to a tragic end in 2009, with the last release being a remake of the original PS1 game for the Wii. One of the other things that seemed to hit me really hard emotionally was finding out that the voice actress for Lolo, Klonoa's love interest or companion for the second game, ended up passing away back in 2011. I even recognized the box art for the Wii game. I swore I saw it years ago, back when I was still a huge Nintendo fanboy at the time. I distinctly remember during that period I pretty much shrugged off anything that wasn't Mario or Sonic as cheap knockoff wannabes. Aside from the handful of other platformers I used to play back on the GameCube when I was younger, I found myself flaring up with guilt and regret. The series seemed to have a pretty active and sizable community despite the series not getting a new entry in almost a decade, so I decided to check out some circles of those dedicated fans. I started to notice how a lot of them really did not seem to like Pac-Man. After blaming the series, and by extension character, for why Klonoa was a dead franchise, I even found a few pieces of hateful or spiteful art, either of Klonoa himself crying over being neglected, or showing straight up envy towards Pac-Man himself. I remember that during the early 2010s, Namco's tried to revitalize the brand with a reboot that not only crashed and burned, but was practically infamous in the entire gaming community. The last Pac-Man game I ever bought was Pac-Man Party, which was just before the whole Ghostly Adventures thing actually kicked off. Ghostly Adventures, being in my eyes, was essentially what killed the franchise off. Ever since the second game happened, Pac-Man had been stuck as small mobile phone titles or weird cross-promotions with things like Red Bull. Pac-Man practically became a laughingstock, even more than something like current-day Sonic the Hedgehog. It didn't take me long to start putting the pieces together. Klonoa seemingly blamed Pac-Man for his neglected status, much like a lot of people online did, but at one point, he used to look up to him as an idol, a figure of inspiration, and in response, he let jealousy get the better of him, causing him to want to outright overthrow his own hero as revenge. Namco milked the heck out of Ghostly Adventures when it was still ongoing, and I know a lot of people just did not want it. Most people I remember were heavily disappointed it wasn't a proper Pac-Man World 4, and the TV show had a very negative reception online in particular. There was also that gravestone I saw in Ghost Bayou, right before Klonoa pushed Pac-Man into the water, drowning him. The name roughly translated to Roro. On my phone, I can't help but find it more than a coincidence after I read about what happened to Lolo's voice actress, and the fact that the ending of Klonoa 2... again, I'm not gonna spoil it. I felt ashamed, and I feel ultimately I kind of deserved what happened. I had what was important to me as a child taken away. Much like Klonoa was to other people, I know it's silly to get emotional over fictional characters, but I almost felt like he would never forgive me. As sort of a memorial for both of these franchises, I put my copies of Pac-Man World 2 and Klonoa 2 on my bookshelf, right next to each other. A few weeks passed, and I found Pac-Man World 3 in the box of games as well, and I've recently been playing through that as I type this. While the game was definitely not as good as its predecessors, plagued with boring combat, and was pretty rough around the edges, I found myself enjoying it a lot more than I did when I was younger. It just pains me to know that this was pretty much the last adventure I had with the franchise before it ultimately just, well, died. I got an email from my friend. He was asking if I was enjoying the PS2 and games he lent me. I decided to respond and mention how I just finished Klonoa 2. "Oh man, Klonoa," he replied. "That series used to be my damn childhood. They just sort of stopped making them. Is there, by any chance, a series you miss?" I took a few minutes reading that last bit before replying again. Yes. Yes, there is. Wait a minute, Sonic isn't Nintendo!